what is it going to take to get us to zero by 2050 in terms of carbon emissions, which is prescribed by the political and business and scientific community. And this is really, it was inspired by people at other green festivals who would say that part of their life was green, and I don't know if they were being serious or not, but they then took that to mean that kind of the rest of their life was green. So I did a little bit of research to see, you know, if you are leading the greenest lifestyle you possibly can, just what does that mean in terms of getting our emissions down to zero by mid-century? And you know, if you are a vegan with solar panels on your roof and you don't drive a car and you have a low waste stream, then where does that actually put us? And so what I've done for this talk is it's really about greenhouse gases. And people say, why don't you look at energy, or why don't you look at transportation or food or waste or any of these things that are all very important in their own right, but they all fall under the umbrella of carbon emissions, and they all basically boil down to the same issue. And so what I've done in beginning this research, I found that the American carbon footprint on an annual basis ranged from 8 to 20 tons, and so I took the median basically of 14, and I wanted to look at all of the different types of energy that you can get, from dirtiest to cleanest, all the types of food you can eat, from healthiest and least carbon polluting to worst in both of those areas. Same thing with transportation, and same thing with just the lifestyle you run and the types of consumption habits you have. And so in terms of energy, not much that's that surprising here in terms of the carbon footprint per unit of energy. Your coal and oil and fossil fuels are all at the dirty end of that scale. Interestingly enough, when you hear companies like ExxonMobil saying that natural gas is 50% the carbon emissions of coal, it's actually true. It's about just over 1,000 tons for coal, the most polluting form of coal, which is lignite, which is something I learned during this research. But then again, natural gas is half of that. But then once you get into renewables, they are all very much so much greener than everything else. Not much of a surprise, but interesting to see that this is actually the case. With food, this is also not that much of a surprise, but a few interesting things. And this chart on the left, I actually updated recently. There was a PhD study that came out with the most up-to-date carbon emissions factors for food products that exists. But what I'd like to call attention to is, yeah, you have a lot of carbon emissions if you are in a meat-heavy diet, but you are not having zero carbon emissions if you are a vegan, which is, quite frankly, was the inspiration from this talk, because I'd hear people say, oh, well, I'm vegan, so I don't have a carbon footprint. And so I wanted to see whether is that the case or not. It turns out you still have about a ton and a half of carbon that you're emitting if you are eating plants. You still got to grow them, you still got to send them, in some cases process them and cook them. And an interesting one here, beef and lamb are far and away, ruminant livestock are far and away the most carbon intensive, but then things like cereals, sugars, fish, eggs, and pork, or fish, eggs, and chicken, all relatively pretty low on that scale. Sorry, go ahead, you had a question. Yes, methane, basically this notation right here is metric tons in CO2 or the equivalent. So yeah, those are factored into this. Interestingly enough, in this study for the carbon footprint of per gram or per kilogram of product, they did not include post-farm gate transportation or processing. So it's really just the raw materials themselves. What is the carbon footprint of them? Yep, go ahead. Yes, so in terms of, wait, sorry, say it again, in terms of fruit? Oh, no, that distinction is not made yet at this point. And this data also comes from another PhD study. They looked at basically what is our carbon footprint going to be if we just grow as we are food-wise, if you have a globally recommended healthy food diet, if you are a vegetarian, and if you are a vegan. And so I have not incorporated fruitarian into this just yet, but I'll look into that for the next time I speak. Thank you. Interesting, the way that the carbon footprint of transportation works down, most people would think flying is number one, far and away. Actually, if you look at it, yeah, driving an SUV and taking a long flight in business class or first class are the highest, but flying a regional flight in economy is about the same as driving an electric car that is not charged by solar panels. And so some people who are buying electric cars think, oh, I'm doing a good job with all this. But if you're using the dirty energy mix, especially depending on your state, then you could have an entirely coal-fired car as opposed to even gas. So interesting there. Same thing with the sedan. I mean, you would imagine just driving a smaller car translates into having a smaller footprint. It's not necessarily the case. So this is an interesting find that I had here. And then in terms of food waste and in terms of the things you consume as a household, like paper towels, toilet paper, napkins, shampoo, soap, the whole deal. Basically, per person, it's a little under a ton, or it's a little under half a ton in North America. The world average is about 500 kilograms of greenhouse gas in terms of food waste per year. And then basically all the stuff you consume at home, it nets out to about 3 tons per person. And so taking all these things, I've outlined a few scenarios that you could be either as an American or a global citizen. These numbers are for America, but you can extrapolate them. What's it going to look like if you're a high emitter all the way down to a low emitter? So if you're a high emitter, you're using the dirtiest energy. You're eating basically only meat. You only drive an SUV and fly first class, and your personal waste and consumption numbers are kind of at those numbers that we showed here. Your footprint comes out to about 23 metric tons per year, which is, if you think about a ton is 2,200 pounds. This is hundreds of thousands of pounds of gas that you're responsible for by living this lifestyle. Then if you take that down a little bit, you make the energy mix a little bit cleaner, you eat a little bit less meat, or a little bit less beef, and then you have kind of these not incredibly fossil intensive transportation methods, and I kept the consumption about the same. That drops a whole 5 tons. So simply changing your energy mix a little bit and changing your diet a little bit can have a huge impact in terms of the carbon footprint you're leaving. 18.17 tons is still a lot. It's still thousands and thousands of pounds of greenhouse gas, but it's less than the worst. Now, kind of a low, middle emitter scenario, you aren't eating meat, or you aren't eating beef. You've completely cut that out. You're using a renewable mix, so you still have some fossil fuels, but you have some solar built into it. That actually has a pretty considerable reduction in the footprint there. Same thing with the transportation. If you are now using a hybrid car and using it right, your footprint is down a little bit less. And I've had now, instead of the American average for waste, it's the world average. And that gets you down to under 10 tons. So that, again, that's almost a full 10 tons by cutting out beef and having a renewable energy mix and being able to control your waste stream a little bit. Then when we get into the lower emitter scenario, that's basically all renewables for all of your energy. You are a vegan or a vegetarian. In this case, I chose vegetarian to show the lowest that we can go. I will update for fruitarian. But fruits stack up in between passive greenhouse and heated greenhouse. So they're kind of in between there. Then for the transportation, you don't own a car, so you have no internal combustion, so your footprint is greatly reduced there. It goes from 2.7 tons to under about a third of a ton. And then for the waste, if you are going to have a waste stream that is equivalent to sub-Saharan Africa for your food waste, that's the low emitter scenario now, and that gets you down to just under 4 tons. Now, okay, that's pretty big to go from 23 tons down to 4 tons. That's substantial. But if we're looking at, and this is a rundown of that, if we're looking at the average, so the average American footprint right now is about 14 tons, or yeah, just under 14 tons, which is basically what we guessed in the beginning. But if you extrapolate that for the world average is 4 tons. And so if we revisit this question of, all right, let's say I'm going to be the greenest person I possibly can be, and if everyone does that in the world, now whether everyone in the world is going to do that is another question, but let's say everyone does, by 2050, they're vegan, they got solar panels on their roof, they don't drive, and they have very, very, very little waste, and they're about as green as you can be. That takes us, from a global perspective, from 35 billion tons down. I'm going to rush through the rest of this slide because we don't have that much time, but basically going from where we are now to everyone being as green as can possibly be as an individual, you only get down from 36 billion tons a year to 27.5 billion tons a year. And if we're there by 2050, it needs to be 0. And so we miss all of these goals when you're talking about the Paris Agreement and government action, individual action, these biggest companies in the world making a difference. Yes, it's a big difference, but it's only about a third of the way there. And so if we're here by 2050, then we're not in such a good spot. And so I don't know if any of you know the science behind this, but why is that a big deal? They're saying that the carbon budget is about almost 3 trillion tons that the world can emit before it warms more than we can really handle in terms of the way that our economies and the way our commerce works and the way that goods and services and commodities are shipped and supplied. It can cause a lot of disruption once these ecosystems get thrown out of whack. And that's what I think is, as a side note, often missed in this climate change discussion. People say, oh, we're killing the world. Or, you know, we're melting everything. Your skin's not going to melt. The world isn't going to explode or implode. It's just going to disrupt the way that we've become so accustomed to running things, and that could really screw stuff up. But so we've burned through most of the carbon budget. We've already had a 1 degree Celsius of warming since the Industrial Revolution. At that 2 degree threshold, things become potentially out of hand. And we have, at this point, it's probably closer to 700 or 600 billion tons per year. And if we are emitting 35 billion tons a year, that gives us about 22 to 35 years to not only have everyone go vegan and be a low emitter, but then mitigate the rest of those 27 billion tons as well. So that's a huge gap, and we don't have that much time to do it. And again, basically, even if we do all these things, we get to 27 billion tons, and we pass this threshold, which is not good for the world. And so basically, it comes down to this question of how are we going to make up this gap? And it really becomes incumbent upon businesses, because once we as consumers do everything we can within our control, it is down to the people who produce the things that we consume to take it upon themselves to basically put that same effort in. Unfortunately, what I'm finding is that it's a similar scenario to individuals. There are about probably close to 6,000 now companies who are reporting their greenhouse gas emissions and are doing anything about it. There are over 100 million businesses in the world, so we have, albeit they make up about the same carbon footprint of the United States, call it like the Fortune 500 or Fortune 2000 or the Global 500, but they still leave about 85% of the global carbon footprint that has to be mitigated by these other 100 or so million businesses. So we have a huge chunk of CO2 that needs to be mitigated by basically everybody. And so what this graph shows is based on 2015, emissions globally have seemingly peaked. I don't think that the science community is necessarily saying that we've hit peak emissions, but they are declining. And so if we are to maintain that trajectory, and this is more so the rate at which they're growing. So the rate at which they're growing has declined, so we're still adding more emissions every year. if we allow this to happen, we need to basically we're going to be here by 2050. We're going to be at the 27 billion ton mark. We need to be at zero. So we are leaving this mismatch of when you add up year over year, it's about 1 trillion tons of CO2 that are going to need to be mitigated that at this point are not going to be addressed through, what we're talking about, everything that I've covered so far. And so how do it seems almost insurmountable at that point. So our business, what we do is we develop projects that either sequester carbon from the atmosphere, so literally reverse these effects, as well as projects that mitigate these effects. And we're partnered with the festival to help them raise money to put money into projects that reduce carbon emissions so that for however much this festival has emitted over the course of the couple of days, and we've estimated it to be about 65 tons. If we purchase 65 of what are called these carbon credits, we are funding the efforts to reduce an equivalent amount of emissions reductions for the amount of emissions that this event is running. And so the model that we're prescribing here effectively is, on one end we have carbon emissions. Those circulate throughout the atmosphere of the globe. It doesn't matter where you emit. It's all one closed system. And on the other end, you have things like carbon sinks, like vast forests that sequester carbon over time. And if you can create processes where you can quantify the amount of CO2 that you're reducing, then you will generate a carbon credit, which you can then either apply to your own emissions. So if I have 2 tons of emissions and I reduce 1, I can apply it to myself to go from 2 emissions to 1 ton of emissions. I can also sell that to you. So if you have 1 ton of emissions and you buy it, you neutralize your emissions. And the idea is that if you build the cost to offset carbon into processes that generate carbon. So in a quick example, if I build another 15 cents into my Blazer, I can offset or mitigate the carbon footprint generated from this much material being produced and shipped and turned into a Blazer and sent to a store where I'm going to buy it. And so what Carbon Credit Capital is working on is a model where simply by doing business, you are able to neutralize the impact of your business, because the cost to mitigate the negative impacts is included in the cost of everything. Even then, how do we make this happen? Again, so you're talking about, call it 30 billion tons as opposed to 34 billion, because let's say the biggest companies in the world are able to actually address this stuff. Again, if you're taking at a cost per ton of carbon at, say, $10, you're talking about a $200 to $400 billion investment annually into neutralizing greenhouse gases. Now, that's a lot. And if you look at the global GDP, it's 0.5% of the global GDP, which is not insignificant. That's more than the GDP of some countries. But when you break that down in terms of 100 million businesses in the world, it comes down to about 400 metric tons per business and about $4,000 to offset that impact. Now, some businesses have a much smaller footprint, but some businesses have a much larger footprint. So that's a generic number. But in many cases, if you're talking about a business paying $4,000 to reduce their carbon emissions, most businesses are not going to do that. Most businesses are going to spend that on their advertising budget, and if it's not financially feasible, it's not going to happen. And it needs to happen. So we're working on a way, again, like I said, to build the cost of these things, as opposed to going to Green Festival and saying, hey, Green Festival, offset the festival for $1,000 or whatever the total footprint is. They can't really budget that out so easily, but it's very affordable for each person to pay a matter of cents or $1 to offset their attendance. And the same thing with the exhibitors. It's a relatively small fee for these exhibitors to mitigate the carbon footprint from them coming here, producing their products, shipping in, shipping out, staying in a hotel, the whole deal. And we have a few case studies here that kind of give you an example of this microeconomic system where simply by adding small costs into products, you can offset the carbon footprint of those products when they're purchased, because the purchase funds the processes to mitigate the carbon associated with each unit. I'm sorry, I'm rushing. I know we're late. We're backed up. So basically, the dynamic that happens here is as a company grows and they produce more things and they spread all over the world, their carbon footprint grows with them. But if you are integrating a cost to offset your business into the business as you grow, the business grows, the production and the sales grow, and the offsets grow with them, but the footprint grows in a converse line. So basically, as you grow, you build in as much positive externality as you do negative externality, so that you can net out as having effectively no impact, even as you have more of an impact, effectively. And so the beauties of these models is they're voluntary models. It's not policy dependent. It provides purchasing power to consumers, because if you have the choice between a carbon neutral product and a dirty product, it gives you the choice to basically, just like Dr. Stein was talking about before we had the brand awards, you have purchasing power to decide where you're putting your dollars, which business you're putting your dollars into. It's the same sort of idea here. And the more businesses that integrate the cost of carbon into them, the more of these projects get funded. And the more of these projects that get funded, the more jobs in renewable energy, in methane recovery and destruction, and the more communities. Our company is very focused on supporting projects that don't just address carbon emissions, but transform communities from socioeconomic and health perspectives as well. And so the more that models like this grow, the more positive of an impact and neutral of an impact we can have on the world. And that's it. Thank you.